Chapter 10. Franklin's Early Efforts to Forge an American Union. It was apparently in 1751, the year Franklin was first elected to the Pennsylvania Assembly, that he began to form in his mind the notion of a single American nation, as opposed to the traditional view of the British plantations as totally separate entities. The activities of the American Philosophical Society and Franklin's duties as postmaster at Philadelphia may have helped bring him to this new perspective, but it took a crisis to turn his thoughts toward a formal plan for uniting the colonies. That crisis was the Indian problem. As the 18th century progressed, English immigrants to America pushed farther and farther west to claim more farmland and establish new settlements. Increasing numbers of Indian tribes were being displaced or threatened by this process, and their resentment and fear were sometimes vented in violent attacks on the frontier settlers. In early 1751, a member of the Governor's Council in New York wrote a pamphlet regarding the importance of friendship with the Indians. Franklin's business partner in New York City, James Parker, was asked to publish the pamphlet. He sent a copy of the manuscript to Franklin for his consideration. In his reply, Franklin agreed with the author of the pamphlet and observed that the surest means of maintaining the Indians' friendship were to convince them that they would benefit by trading with the English, and to unite the several governments so as to form a strength that the Indians may depend on for protection in case of a rupture with the French, or apprehend great danger from if they should break with us. A voluntary union entered into by the colonies themselves, I think, would be preferable to one imposed by Parliament, for it would be perhaps not much more difficult to procure and more easy to alter and improve as circumstances should require and experience direct. Were there a general council formed by all the colonies and a general governor appointed by the crown to preside in that council, or in some manner to concur with and confirm their acts and take care of the execution, everything relating to Indian affairs and the defense of the colonies might be properly put under their management. Each colony should be represented on the basis of its payments into the common treasury for the common expense. Perhaps if the council were to meet successfully at the capitals of the several colonies, they might thereby become better acquainted with the circumstances, interests, strength or weakness, etc., of all, and thence be able to judge better of measures proposed from time to time. At least it might be more satisfactory to the colonies if this were proposed as a part of the scheme, for a preference might create jealousy and dislike. He further suggested that Parker urge the appointment of several influential New Yorkers to be sent in the nature of ambassadors to the other colonies, where they might apply particularly to all the leading men, and by proper management get them to engage in promoting the scheme. If the endeavor were handled skillfully, said Franklin, I imagine such a union might thereby be made and established. As it turned out, nothing came of the proposal. But Franklin's thinking on this occasion had laid the groundwork for a more extensive undertaking 3 years later. Having conceived a union of the American provinces, Franklin now began to look more critically at the relationship between the colonies and the mother country. For some time, the English Parliament had been exporting convicted felons to America for the improvement and well-peopling of the colonies. Efforts of the colonial assemblies to prevent or limit this practice were repeatedly rebuffed by Parliament. So in May 1751, Franklin decided to take aim at the British government with his sharp pen. Writing under the name Americanus in the Pennsylvania Gazette, he satirically proposed a fitting response to the continuing importation of English criminals. Such a tender parental concern in our mother country for the welfare of her children calls aloud for the highest returns of gratitude and duty. In some of the uninhabited parts of these provinces, there are numbers of these venomous reptiles we call rattlesnakes. Felons, convict from the beginning of the world, in the spring of the year, when they first creep out of their holes, they are feeble, heavy, slow, and easily taken. And if a small bounty were allowed per head, some thousands might be collected annually and transported to Britain. There I would propose to have them carefully distributed in St. James Park, in the spring gardens and other places of pleasure about London, in the gardens of all the nobility and gentry throughout the nation, but particularly in the gardens of the prime ministers, the lords of trade, and members of Parliament, for to them we are most particularly obliged. Also in 1751, Franklin wrote an impressive paper wherein he objected to an act recently passed by Parliament, at the urging of British ironmasters, to restrict the manufacture of iron in Pennsylvania. Britain should not too much restrain manufactures in her colonies, he declared. A wise and good mother will not do it. To distress is to weaken, and weakening the children weakens the whole family. In the same paper, he noted that the population growth rate in America was much more dynamic than that of England due to the vast amounts of land available to colonial settlers and their children. He predicted that our people must at least be doubled every 20 years and that all of North America would eventually be inhabited. Franklin could foresee the day when the mother country would have to listen more carefully to the economic and political demands of the American people. In August 1753, Franklin took on another responsibility which further developed his emerging vision of a united America. He was appointed with William Hunter of Virginia as Deputy Postmaster General of the American colonies. Up to this time, the postal operation had been characterized by debt and inefficiency, but Franklin and Hunter changed that. By demanding prompt and careful accounting from local postmasters and by investing their own money to redesign the system, they not only increased their own salaries, but produced the first surplus income the American department had ever earned. In fact, they eventually brought it to yield 3 times as much clear revenue to the Crown as the Post Office of Ireland. Because of Hunter's ill health, Franklin had to assume the principal responsibility for a successful operation, and he traveled widely throughout the colonies to inspect, audit, and improve the service of local post offices. Theretofore, his public duties had kept him in Pennsylvania, but in the 4-year period following his 1753 appointment, he was away from home a total of 14 months. The reforms he introduced in the postal system, including such innovations as local home delivery and a dead letter office, resulted in a substantial increase of correspondence among the American provinces. It had been said that no one man before him had ever done so much to draw the scattered colonies together. The French launched an official expedition in 1753 to build forts along the Ohio River. Recognizing the threat that a French collaboration with the Indian tribes would pose to English settlements, the British Board of Trade instructed several colonial governors in 1754 to appoint commissioners and send them to Albany, New York, for the purpose of treating officially with the chiefs of the confederation of tribes known as the Six Nations. Franklin, who had already had some experience with the Indians, he had served on a commission in October 1753 to conclude a boundary agreement with the Six Nations, was among the delegates selected in Pennsylvania. Even before his appointment, he had been deeply concerned about the growing prospects of war. In the May 9, 1754 issue of the Pennsylvania Gazette appeared America's first political cartoon, designed and probably drawn by Franklin. It pictured a snake cut into 8 segments, labeled with initials representing New England, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina, and was captioned "Join or Die." This illustration was accompanied by a comment on the necessity of colonial union. The confidence of the French in this undertaking seems well grounded in the present disunited state of the British colonies and the extreme difficulty of bringing so many different governments and assemblies to agree to any speedy and effectual measures for our common defense and security, while our enemies have the great advantage of being under one direction, with one council and one purse. The cartoon was often reprinted in other colonial newspapers that year to urge the idea of American unity against the French. It would be used again 20 years later at the outbreak of the American Revolution to urge unity against the British. Franklin worried not only about disunity among the colonies themselves, but also about the ill feelings which were stirring between the Americans and the mother country as a result of certain acts of Parliament. On May 28th, he confided his feelings to a friend in London. "I am heartily concerned at the dissensions so unseasonably kindling in the colony assemblies, when unanimity is become more than ever necessary to frustrate the designs of the French. May I presume to whisper my sentiments in a private letter? Britain and her colonies should be considered as one whole, and not as different states with separate interests. Instructions from the Crown to the colonies should have in view the common weal of that whole to which partial interests ought to give way, and they should never aim at extending the prerogative beyond its due bounds, nor abridging the just liberties of the people. In short, they should be plainly just and reasonable, and rather savor of fatherly tenderness and affection than of masterly harshness and severity." Several years later, after the struggle between the colonists and the British government became central focus of Franklin's life, these ideas would echo through his correspondence again and again. On his way to New York, Franklin wrote a paper which he called "Short Hints Toward a Scheme for Uniting the Northern Colonies." It was similar to the proposal he had sent to James Parker in 1751, though some elaboration was now added. Upon reaching New York City, he showed the paper to 2 gentlemen of great knowledge in public affairs, and being fortified by their approbation, I ventured to lay it before the Congress. After the commissioners assembled in Albany and voted in favor of establishing a union of some kind, he learned that several other delegates, perhaps influenced by Franklin's cartoon, had also come with the same idea and had submitted plans of their own. A committee was then appointed, one member from each colony, to consider the several plans and report. Mine happened to be preferred, and with a few amendments was accordingly reported. By this plan, the general government was to be administered by a president general appointed and supported by the crown, and a grand council to be chosen by the representatives of the people of the several colonies met in their respective assemblies. The debates upon it in the Albany Congress went on daily, hand in hand with the Indian business. Many objections and difficulties were started, but at length they were all overcome, and the plan was unanimously agreed to, and copies ordered to be transmitted to the Board of Trade and to the assemblies of the several provinces. Unfortunately, the Albany Plan of Union was rejected by both sides. Its fate was singular, wrote Franklin. The assemblies did not adopt it as they all thought there was too much prerogative in it, and in England it was judged to have too much of the democratic. Even the Pennsylvania House of Representatives reacted unfavorably. They took it up when I happened to be absent, he recalled, which I thought not very fair, and reprobated it without paying any attention to it at all, to my no small mortification. Nor was the Albany Congress any more successful in its primary object. Although a general treaty was established, renewing the Indians' earlier covenants with the English, no conclusive solution was actually reached. There were many who favored a union of the colonies under some other arrangement. One of these was Governor William Shirley of Massachusetts, who proposed a smaller governing body composed of the royal governors and one or two members of each of their councils. In other words, all officers of the general government would be chosen by the crown and none by the American people. Funds for defense of the colonies would be raised through taxes imposed by Parliament. Franklin discussed this plan with Governor Shirley in December 1754 during a trip to Boston, and later in the month he sent 3 letters which carefully articulated his objections. These remarkable letters, which have since become valuable historical documents, contain the essential elements of the arguments used by American patriots 20 years later during their bitter struggle for independence. Several excerpts will give an indication of Franklin's deep insight into the fundamental problems besetting Anglo-American relations. Excluding the people of the colonies from all share in the choice of the Grand Council will give extreme dissatisfaction, as well as the taxing them by act of Parliament where they have no representative. The people will say, and perhaps with justice, that it is supposed an undoubted right of Englishmen not to be taxed but by their own consent, given through their representatives. That of the colonies have no representatives in Parliament. That to propose taxing them by Parliament and refuse them the liberty of choosing a representative council to meet in the colonies and consider and judge of the necessity of any general tax and the quantum or amount shows suspicion of their loyalty to the crown or of their regard for their country or of their common sense and understanding, which they have not deserved. That compelling the colonies to pay money without their consent would be rather like raising contributions in an enemy's country than taxing of Englishmen for their own public benefit. That it would be treating them as a conquered people and not as true British subjects. As we are not suffered to regulate our trade and restrain the importation and consumption of British superfluities, our whole wealth centers finally Our whole wealth centers finally among the merchants and inhabitants of Britain, and if we make them richer and enable them better to pay taxes, it is nearly the same as being taxed ourselves and equally beneficial to the crown. But to pay immediate heavy taxes in the laying, approbation, and disposition of which we have no part, must seem a hard measure to Englishmen, who cannot conceive that by hazarding their lives and fortunes in subduing and settling new countries, extending the dominion and increasing the commerce of the mother nation, they have forfeited the native rights of Britons. Uniting the colonies more intimately with Great Britain by allowing them representatives in Parliament would be very acceptable to the colonies, provided they had a reasonable number of representatives allowed them, and that at the old acts of Parliament restraining the trade or cramping the manufactures of the colonies be at the same time repealed, and the British subjects on this side of the water put in those respects on the same footing with those in Great Britain. Manufacture employs and enriches British subjects, but it is of any importance to the state whether the manufacturers live in Birmingham or Sheffield, or both, since they are still within its bounds and their wealth and persons still at its command. Could the Goodwin sands be laid dry by banks and land equal to a large country thereby gained to England and presently filled with English inhabitants, would it be right to deprive such inhabitants of the common privileges enjoyed by other Englishmen, the right of vending their produce in the same ports, or of making their own shoes, because a merchant or a shoemaker living on the old land might fancy it more for his advantage to trade or make shoes for them? Would this be right even if the land were gained at the expense of the state? And would it not seem less right if the charge and labor of gaining the additional territory to Britain had been borne by the settlers themselves? And would not the hardship appear yet greater if the people on the new country should be allowed no representatives in the Parliament enacting such impositions? As it turned out, no scheme for colonial union was actually implemented until many years after the Albany Congress. Franklin later reflected, "The different and contrary reasons of dislike to my plan make me suspect that it was really the true medium, and I am still of opinion it would have been happy for both sides of the water if it had been adopted." And that's the end of chapter 10.